It's Friday, and I'm back with the next in our Fanzine Friday series. Today we're taking a look at The Apprentice number 4 from 1979. Please stick around. I'm AZ Mountaineer, and this is our channel, Old School Rules, where we celebrate the community of old school gamers and grognards who like classic RPGs, miniatures, magazines, and everything that goes with it. Each week on the Fanzine Friday series, I take a fanzine from my collection off the shelf for a closer look. Today, that's The Apprentice from the spring of 1979. Hope you enjoy the video. We're continuing our look at the fanzine from the Great White North of Canada. This is The Apprentice, number 4. It's from the spring of 1979. David Berman is the editor and driving force behind the fanzine. This fanzine is sort of a square size, like all of them are, which is a different size than most of the fanzines we've been looking at. This is essentially like legal size piece of paper folded in half, stapled. You'll notice the cover is sort of a slick material here, not just paper, any heavy stock paper anymore, but it continues to be obviously paper inside stapled through the middle. The Apprentice, you may recall, is famous or infamous because of a bit of a feud between David Berman and Gary Gygax. In issue number 2, which is certainly the most famous, I guess you'd say, of this series, he has a critique that Berman does of the Dragon magazine. And Gary Gygax takes pains in the Dragon magazine number 22 to really go after Berman in his fanzine in response. Berman responds in issue number 3, and he continues to throw a little shade in the direction of Mr. Gygax in this issue. We'll talk about that in just a minute. The cover art is by Bruce White. He's done the covers from the very beginning, and so let's take a look at that cover. You'll notice it says the Domeigns of Bellamy here across the middle. One of the features, or the way that they set up the Apprentice fanzine from the very beginning, there's an adventure right in the middle, and there's also new monsters and magic items that tie into that adventure in every one of these issues. And so the Domeigns of Bellamy is the adventure in this issue we'll talk about. You'll notice under that it calls it a complete MFRP dungeon adventure. And one of the things that Berman does, which one of the things Gygax responds to, is he says, rather than doing things for Dungeons and Dragons, we should be, and it's part of his philosophy, is his magazine, he wants it to be generically or universally applicable to anyone who's running a fantasy role-playing game. And he, Berman, says instead of just fantasy, he's going to call it MFRP, medieval fantasy role-playing. The idea of dragons and knights and elves and that kind of thing. He's trying to be a little more specific. And this cover art it is a scene from the adventure, so it ties directly into that in a way. I'm not sure that the art on the other ones have, or at least I never noticed if they were supposed to be a tie-in there before. Here's our table of contents. He's got an editorial. His editorial, as they say, talks about the fanzine. A couple of things to point out, I think, are worthwhile in there. He says this completes the first year of publication. He feels like, we stayed on schedule with sort of a quarterly release. He asserts it's been improving every time. Certainly, he talks about the technical improvements, like now the glossy cover. He says they've switched from something called electro-stenciled stencil duplication to the offset process. I can tell you, can't really show you, but I can tell you that this fanzine is, the way it's assembled is messed up. When they folded they didn't set the pages to center when they folded them and stapled them, and so the first 3-4 letters and several pages are cut off because they're over on the other side of the fold, and you can't, makes it a little hard to read without disassembling the fanzine, which I did not choose to disassemble it and try and put it back together. He thinks the typeface and other things about the layout have improved. I don't really notice much of that. He says the content has been improving. I will say this, he's certainly getting contributions, as we'll see. He no longer has to do all the work himself, and that's a good thing. He's had some very consistent columns throughout, as we'll notice here in just a second as well. So here's the part I want to point out to you. So he says our fanzine is becoming established. The print run has doubled. It's been sold in 7 countries. So that's impressive and an interesting historical note. Now, let's get into the fun stuff. Gary Gygax, dictator of Dungeons and Dragons, thought it important to devote 1.5 pages of the biggest fantasy role-playing magazine, The Dragon, for his personal, slanderous, libelous, and rude comments on The Apprentice. One wonders why someone who believes The Apprentice is, quote, the most unintentionally funny amateur effort at journalism to date in the annals of gaming hobby, end quote, would allot such expansive space to an essay of pouting, parading, and ridicule. Perhaps Mr. Gygax has something on his mind which he is not disclosing. So, Gygax, to his credit, only writes the critique of the Apprentice one time. He doesn't come back and forth. But Dave Berman is not letting it go. He goes on to say he's confident things are going to continue to improve, and like most of the people who are doing these things are not making any money. They basically just reinvest what they make back into the fanzine and trying to make it better. Okay, let's talk about this table of contents. So we've got the editorial I just sort of mentioned. Heir of CowQuest is the fantasy fiction story, which is usually in 2 or 3 pages, and Jason Byers is the author. I'm liking it. You'll remember we start off with 2 characters. One of them has been killed, and a remaining hero who sort of can connect to his deity and have that deity like take over his body, or his spirit moves into his body and gives him special powers. He tracks down the guys who killed his colleague and almost tried to kill him, and finds them and kills the leader in a very gruesome way. And now he's repulsed by what he's done and tells the deity to get out and leave him alone. The deity leaves, but with a warning that, like, sort of you can't turn your back on me without consequences. So we'll see what happens next time in terms of consequences. Sorcerer's Apprentice is a recurring article that has a suggestion on how to improve your gaming. The Fantasy Forum is an article from Ed Simbalist, the driving force between chivalry and sorcery, talking about how to create a campaign world. It's going to be a 2-part article. The Monster Madness, New Monsters, Orbs and Artifacts, New Magic Items connect to the campaign, which is the Domeigns of Bellamy. Scribes and Scrolls are their review, and this time, remember, they've looked at the Dragon and then White Dwarf, and this time they're looking at Chaosium's magazine, Different Worlds, which they like quite a bit. So here, finally, a magazine they don't have much criticism of. I think in part because it was, like him, took a very broad approach to being inclusive in the type of material that was in there. Spear Thrust, which is their combat system. The Campaign Trail is suggestions for insert for your campaign, which is more on the weather system. Galadriel's Mirror is what's going on in the gaming world, so conventions and publications. And then classified information is stuff that's available for sale. The folks who contribute: Dave Berman, obviously the primary driver of that. Jason Byers is the author of the fantasy fiction. Richard Best contributes to the campaign system. Rene Steenbergen has the article on weather. Bill Roberts also has a contribution under the Spear Thrust area. He's got this idea. He's the one who's come up with this idea of training to make your character get a bonus. And then Marc Tyrrell contributes all the Bellamy stuff: the monsters, the magic items, and the campaign itself. And then we have our artists, Bruce Wright and Dave Sweet, Reva Abramovich, Mike Desjardins, Paul Vaz, and Pierre Delacroix. And I'll try to point out their artists as we move along. Here's their table of contents, and you can see on the left-hand side how the text is sort of chopped off because of the way they folded or printed or folded the pages. This art, the Knight on Horseback, that is Lacroix's art. Here's the first article, the Sorcerer's Apprentice section. This is Impedimentia, which means that which impedes in ancient Roman, it says. The short of it is he was talking about playing his campaign. They used miniatures and had a map sort of laid out in 2 dimensions, and he just didn't find it to be realistic, and it wasn't working when you came to intersections. And so he basically sat down with some cardboard, cut pieces. You can see the diagram here of how he used tape to to set up his wall, so the next time they played, they had basically like a three-dimensional dungeon where there were walls on the side in addition to floor. And he's just suggesting how easy it was. You can draw on the cardboard or whatever you get, poster board, to make it, and he's suggesting that'll make your campaign a lot more fun. This article is by Ed Simbalist. It's called Designing Worlds. Like a campaign world, he says, there's a lot of, again, sort of shade, sideways criticism, right, being thrown towards Dungeons and Dragons by some of these folks. And Simbalist did that a decent amount because, they were highly critical of him, and he's trying to defend what he thinks improvements and the advantages of his own chivalry and sorcery system. But he talks about how basically the campaign world is really undeveloped because it's all about going into dungeons and, traps, tricks, monsters, etc. And you don't really care about the story or the fantasy world in which that's been placed, which is, probably fairly true of how the game was being played. And he said that's okay, that's a game, but a better game has the realism and the depth of a whole world, and where the sort of dungeon delving is only a small part of that. He talks about how you can do that in theory, and he also goes through on sort of a tangent that takes half the article talking about his game, responding to some criticisms that it's too stiff, too realistic, and doesn't do a good enough job of bringing in fantasy elements. So here's this page introduces, this is LaCroix's art, the Bellamy section of the fanzine. It's almost like an insert. It's not, but it's sort of laid out that way. It says, Bellamy, his monsters, treasures, and lair follow. When in doubt, follow your heart. And he's got that phrase in the adventure itself. So the first thing he has, a new monster, are radiation globes. And so let me jump ahead to the adventure. There's a spacecraft that's crashed, and it's brought some alien technology or creatures here. And these radiation globes are one of those things. There's 4 types: uranium, strontium, gold, and plutonium. And each one, it's basically a ball. You can sort of see the art at the bottom. It's sort of a ball of this substance, and then it can shoot out a beam. Or if you attack it, you'll take the same effects as a beam. Uranium doesn't damage armor. It goes straight through and basically radiates the character. Does D6 damage. If you get hit 3 times, your hair falls off and you start getting marks on your skin. And every hit after that, you start losing temporarily some charisma points. The strontium doesn't do damage to yourself, but it damages the metal and makes it hot, unless it's magical or mithril. And if you keep wearing hot armor, you'll begin to take burning damage. And it can ultimately destroy the metal itself, whether that's a sword or armor. The gold radiation takes away your speed, so 10%, and then 10% of the reduced, so that it's not like after 10 turns you'd be at 0, but it keeps diminishing. And then platinum takes away your strength, 10% every hit, same way. So that's it's an interesting monster and something the characters haven't seen before. There is within the dungeon something that will counter that. The wizard Bellamy has, I don't know if he found or created, I guess he created these daggers that can absorb, and he's got one for each of the elements. These daggers that can absorb the ray or the radiation coming from one of those things. So if you have all 4 together, you can just sort of hold them up in front of you, and one of those will work to absorb the ray. They're +1 enchantment, and the really cool thing about them is if they absorb that radiation, then they can release it when they strike back on something. So you can sort of charge it up and then go and hit somebody with it. The adventure is called the Domeigns of Bellamy. And in essence, there's this spaceship that's crashed. The wizard knows about something fell from the sky. He goes to investigate. He discovers it. He hires some dwarves to, and he wants to study it, and it's plowed down into the earth. And he has these dwarves excavate an area for him to put his lair in underground for whatever reason he wants to be underground, where he's going to study all this stuff and obviously keep it secret. The dwarves are tricksy and a little bit on the evil side, and they create some additional passageways he doesn't know about. And then when they're all done and he's happy, they go recruit a whole bunch of dwarves, come back and attack him. And the scene you see there on the cover is he has cast some spell and basically paralyzed all of them, where they are paralyzed apparently permanently and starved to death. And then he's, for some reason, put a spell that puts him into inanimate suspension, at least until you show up and disturb him. So he's still there and alive. And here's the side view that, for whatever reason, I'm not a huge fan of this. I like side views, but I like them in connection with the overhead view, right? So I get a little confused sometimes about how this works. But I guess they're more concerned with the relation of things than they are to the dimensions, which they describe in the narratives. But so here you can see the side view. You start on A, find the secret way, and you make your way down through various rooms. Scribes and Scrolls this time, as I mentioned, looks at different worlds. It's put out by Chaosium. The thing he really likes about it is, as he says, it's not about promoting Chaosium products. He says, like, one article talking about their products, there's one advertisement for their products. Everything else is very open to advertising, talking about other games specifically, and sort of universally applicable articles or ideas as well. So this one, no critique, all thumbs up. Spear Thrust, this combat system I've mentioned. To me, it's so complex. Maybe it's easier after you play it. It just makes my head hurt a little bit. And so I probably, if I'd had this at the time, would not have entertained it. But here we have the next layer, which is how you, the process of the math problems you go through for distance weapons, and then the similar math problems you go through if you want to try and do a parry. The other article here is about, remember before there was an article about proficiency with your weapons. Now we've got proficiency with your shield. And you can, through experience, based on your dexterity, you've got sort of maximums on how good you can get. And what he does is you track your number of melee combats. And so from 1 to over 100. And the more, depending on how dexterous you are, the faster you can get better. The more combats you have, at some point you add additional bonuses. If you have a 16 or better dexterity, as an example, you get a +1 right from the start with your shield, in addition to the normal advantage of a shield. At 76, you get +2, and at over 100, you get +3, an additional benefit to your defense. If you've got an 11 to 15, you have to get to 100 before you get a +2. Everybody else is going to max out at a +1. You can also do training where you spend gold and work with somebody who's already got at least a +2 bonus, so high dexterous character, and they can, through gold and time, train you and give you those pluses as well. And then you've got some bonuses based on your prime requisite, whether you need more or less time based on the normal chart. So that's a system. I think it's interesting. I think you're just making your characters more powerful, and I don't think that's necessary. That's just me. More weather, because you didn't get enough last time. So now we've got a chart here, step 8. If there's precipitation, what type? Snow, hail, rain, sleet, etc. And then some modifiers. If you're in a winter climate, you're going to tend to mostly get the winter effects. If you're in a jungle climate, you tend to get mostly the summer effects. As time goes by, desert, coastline, etc. He's got some changes based on the climate where the characters are. I always like this one, Galadriel's Mirror. It's little snapshots, into history, right? So he announces the Charles Robert Awards for 1978, where you can nominate things. He suggests perhaps you'd like to nominate The Apprentice for the Semi-Pro Magazine Award. He tells you how to send those in to Origin. Magazines of note, different worlds, which he mentioned. Evermist, which he describes as a fine fantasy fanzine. And my understanding is that, and he's mentioned it's ceased publication. And my understanding is that is just fantasy fiction. There's no RPG stuff in there at all, at least as far as I've ever heard or been able to determine. News from Bree, he says, has the new mailing address to Hartley Patterson, and we've done a number of fanzine videos on the News from Bree fanzines that I have in my collection. Trollcrusher, which is one of the more popular ones, it's the APA style where everybody sends in a few pages and then they sort of assemble them into the fanzine that gets published. And they say we've switched owners again, and now Lawrence Miller is taking over operation of that. And John Baile, I may be mispronouncing that, is going to refund current subscriptions, so then you'll have to subscribe again if you want to continue to do that. In terms of conventions, Tippecanoe and Fantasy 2 is happening in West Lafayette, Indiana. The Great Canadian Games Adventure is happening in Ottawa. Gary Gygax was supposed to be a special guest at that one. Michicon 8 Games Fest is happening in Detroit. This is done by the Metro Detroit Game folks, who are pretty well known for doing things like Origins and WinterCon, etc. And then Origins 79 will be happening at Widener University in Chester, PA. Here is, they call it now the Apprentice Apothecary. This is their classified where they're selling stuff. And now they're basically just showing you what they're selling. They're selling you some hex sheets, the acetate clear cover you can put over that and draw on with like dry erase markers. And again, they've got these computer-generated character sheets that you recall they had a problem with it. They didn't like them at first. Apparently they've worked that out. And now they're ready to sell you some more of their computer-generated character sheets. And here's Paul Voss has got the artwork here on the back cover. This is our knight, and he has slain this dragon, and so he's very happy about himself, and he's holding up his sword and posing for the drawing. That's it for the Apprentice number 4, the latest in our fanzine series. We've got 2 more to go, and we'll round out all of the Apprentice fanzines that were published. Have a great weekend. I hope you guys are enjoying the channel. If you hope you're subscribed, and if you got friends who might enjoy it, I hope you'll send them our way. Maybe they can be subscribers as well. Have a great weekend. Roll some dice with your friends, and until next time, keep rolling 20s.